Alright guys, so welcome back to another video. So we're going to talk about scope, which I have mentioned a lot in the previous videos, but now we're actually going to dive into it and we're going to talk about it, and it's going to give you a better understanding. And then also we're going to go back to very early stages of our tutorial, of our series, when I mentioned the difference between var, let, and const, but we're then going to compare the let keyword with the var keyword and what are the differences when it comes to declaring variables with those two keywords. Okay, I know I've used let and I've said not to worry so much about it, but we're gonna talk about it now. Awesome. Okay, so we've gone this far. We can start diving into scope. And again, I know I've made it seem like it was some hard concept, but it's not. Okay, so scope, all it is just defines the visibility of a variable. It defines the region of a program where a variable is considered visible or valid. Okay, and there's pretty much two types of scopes. There's the global scope and the local scope. Okay, so the global scope is pretty much all variable declarations, function declarations, symbols, bindings, etc. that are accessible to all other functions, classes, and whatever other declarations you have. And usually variables defined outside of a function are global, and I'll show you what I mean in just a sec. Okay, and when I say global, you can think, okay, well, global, that should mean, hey, anyone can use it. Anyone has access to that entity, to that binding. Okay? For local scope, pretty much local scope means that variables or functions that are declared inside a function are function scoped or local scoped. Okay, they have function scope. And all that means is that these declarations, these variables, functions can only be accessed from within the function it was declared in. Okay? So now that we've talked about the two differences, we're going to go ahead and take a look at some examples. So let's go into our text editor. So here's the first example I'm going to show you guys. Okay, so we're going to analyze this code because I know I have it pre-written, but we're going to analyze it and hopefully it'll make some sense, because the scope is really something that you really need to kind of see some code to understand. And then when you code, you'll actively think, okay, this variable is in this scope, this variable in that scope, and it'll answer so many of your questions. Okay, so I know this is a little bit of a, this is kind of messy, but let me see if I can get rid of this and get rid of this. Okay, I should have not left this open in all the episodes because it's just so much distraction. Okay, let me actually open back my terminal. Okay, so we can see over here that we have, on line 3, we have a variable declaration. Okay, the variable is called my name, and we assign the value Anson. Okay, this variable is declared globally. It's declared outside a function. Okay, we only have one function, and it's declared outside of it. Okay, even if we didn't have this function over here, right, this would still be considered a global variable. So pretty much every single function that we create can access this variable without hesitation, and there would be no error at all. Okay, so remember, this is in the global scope right now. Okay, on line 6, we have a function declaration. Okay, we have this function is called sendMessage, and it takes in one parameter. On line 7, we're pretty much logging hello, concatenate with my name. So whatever the value of my name is going to be logged to the console. And then on line 10, we have the function invocation of sendMessage. Okay, we're calling the function sendMessage. Now there are some weird things that you might notice, such as why are we not passing a parameter into sendMessage? But I want to have these weird things here just to show you guys the difference. Okay, so first question is, what happens when I remove the parameter my name? So right now I have one parameter. Okay, so when I'm concatenating hello with my name, the value of my name should be whatever the value this parameter is. Okay, because what's going on is, even though I have my name declared up here, inside this function, this parameter is technically part of the scope of this function. Right? When we declare a new function, it has its own scope. Okay, all variables declared inside the scope belongs to that function, and it cannot be accessed outside of this function. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this code, and let's just see what happens. So let me zoom out a little bit. And let's do, what is it, scope, node scope1.js. You're going to see it says hello undefined. Let's understand why. Okay, so over here on line 10, we're not passing in any value here. Okay, so my name over here, the value of this is undefined because we didn't pass in anything here. Okay, you're probably wondering, well, why isn't it referencing this global variable here? Because my name is function scoped to this function over here. Okay, it's a parameter. It belongs to the scope of send message. Now we can change. We can fix this. We can pass in a value. We can just say, I don't know, Andy. All right, and if I run this program again, you're going to see now it says hello Andy because now we passed in a value. It's no longer undefined. Okay, so watch this. Let's get rid of this, and let's get rid of this. Okay, now you're probably going to guess. Okay, so on line 7, it's going to print out hello. And my name is going to print out Anson. Now in this case, you're probably wondering, well, why is it going to log Anson now? Shouldn't it log undefined because we don't have a parameter listed over here in this function, right? And if we run it, you're going to see it says hello Anson. And notice how I'm not passing any parameter. My name is the global variable, my name over here, right? And the reason why it's printing out Anson is because my name is in the global scope. You can also call it a global variable. Okay, but it's in the global scope, which means that this function over here can access this variable. Okay, we can create another function like this. We can say display name, and then we can just log this. Your name is my name, and this function would also log. Oh wait, we're not calling it. This function would also log the global variable my name to the console. Your name is Anson. We can also declare a function inside a function. Okay, function. I don't know. Let's do something else. Let's just say function do something. Right, and inside this function, now that we've created a new function inside another function, this function also has its own scope. Okay, you can think of it like this. Every single time you have a set of curly braces, it has its own scope. It's its own body. Everything that belongs inside that scope is not accessible outside of it. But everything that's inside that scope can be accessed within deeper scopes. And again, I'll explain later on. Okay, but we can also access this variable, my name, right over here. And it will also log it out. Oh, we're not calling it, sorry. So we should actually call it. So we can call this function inside here. Okay, so yes, you can declare a function inside a function, and you can also call that function as well. Okay, cool. Now let's do this, right? So right now you can see Anson is being logged from line 13. Now we have this function. This is a function declared inside this function. Okay, and this is a concept called closure, which we're not going to talk about right now, but we're going to talk about later on in advanced topics. But let's try to invoke do something on line 18, right? And you're going to get an error. It's going to give you this error, and it's going to say do something is not defined. And why is that the case? Shouldn't this be in the scope? Well, no, because remember, this function declaration is declared inside function display name, and since this declaration is declared inside a function, this is locally scoped. Okay, so you cannot access this outside of the scope of display name. You can access it anywhere inside of display name, but you can't access it outside of it. Okay, likewise, I can declare other variables too, such as let x equal 2. Okay, but what if I try to access that outside of the function do something over here? Let's try and do that, and let's see what happens. So let's go ahead and call do something, and let's see what happens. We get another error, right? And what's the error? Let's look at it. You can see it says x is not defined. But wait a minute. Isn't x defined on line 14? Well, it is, right? But x is defined locally. It's defined locally to the function do something. And since this whole function display name does not share scope with do something, right? Because everything that's declared inside do something can only be accessed inside that scope, right? So you cannot access variables that are inside the scope of an inner scope, if that makes sense. So since x is declared inside this function scope over here, we can't access it outside of it, right? It's not visible outside over here. Okay, it's visible inside here, like I can definitely access it inside here, right? But I can't access it outside of it. Okay, notice how we get no errors. And I can also create another function called do something else. And I can then reference this variable x over here inside this function, right? And I can do it because do something else, this function, is also, it shares the scope of do something, right? So it pretty much shares all of the declarations that's inside do something, because this function is inside the do something scope. Okay, so if I log it, you're gonna see it says 2 right over here, and that's being logged on line 17. Okay, I know it's it might be very confusing, but just think of it like this, right? Everything that's declared inside a function can be shared in deeper scopes. Okay, so the more scopes that you declare later, like down the line, those functions also share the scope of the other one. So it's kind of like you have display name is kind of like the parent scope, and then you have do something as its child, and then do something else as the child of do something, right? All the variables that are declared inside display name can be used in do something else, right? So for example, if I declare a variable called let I don't know, age equal 21, I can certainly reference that variable inside do something else, because do something else shares the scope of display name. Okay, and same thing with do something shares the scope of display name as well. But display name does not share the scope of do something else, and it does not share the scope of do something. Okay, so variables declared inside these functions cannot be accessed outside. So hopefully that makes some sense, and if it doesn't, definitely just leave a comment down below. But I'm sure I think I explained it in a good way, but again, just leave a comment down below if you have any trouble. Okay, so I'm trying to show a couple other examples as well, because I feel like one example is not going to be enough. So let's take a look at maybe, I guess this example, but really it's just the same thing. So I have another example over here. We have do something, right? We have function do something. This is a global function. We can reference this wherever we want. Okay, now we have a variable called let y equal 2, or we have a variable called y, we assign it the value 2, and we have a function that's declared inside the scope of do something. Okay, so we can reference this function only inside this do something scope. So if I try to call something else outside over here, you're going to see that we're going to run into some trouble. Well, this is scope number 2. We're going to get an error. It's going to say, what is it? Well, first we have x is not defined because of this other error, but let me get to that first. So, but for example, so I would still get an error if I tried to call something else outside of line 13, because something else is not visible in the global scope. It's only visible locally to do something. Okay, so another error that we can see over here with this scope is that in something else in this function, right, we're declaring a variable called x, and we're assigning the value 2, and we're trying to access it outside of the local scope of something else, and that's why we're getting this error. It says x is not defined. We're trying to log it, but it says x is not defined. Okay, so let's get rid of that, and let's continue on, and you're going to see we have another error. It says something else is not defined, because we're trying to invoke this function that's when it's outside the scope. Cool. And as you can see, we log 2, and this is being logged inside the scope of do something else. It's being logged inside the function something else, but since the variable y shares the scope with something else, we can reference it. Okay, it's visible in this scope. Okay, we can also change the value of y. Okay, so we set y equal to 3, and so after this function call, I can go ahead and log y, and you're going to see that it's going to log 3, just like that. Okay. Okay, so honestly, I feel like there are actually a lot of differences or a lot of explanations when it comes to var versus let, which I think it deserves its own video in an advanced JavaScript tutorial series. So we're not going to go super crazy and super deep into the whole major difference between var versus let, but I'm just going to mention just some of the major differences that are very common for people that you should know. Okay, so var is function scoped. So when you declare a variable with var, that means it's known throughout the entire function. Whereas when you declare a variable with let, it's only known within the block, which is basically curly braces. And I'll show you a couple examples. And again, block scope, so function scope basically means that all bindings are visible within the function. So it's known throughout the entire function. Whereas block scope, it's known throughout the entire curly braces. And if you try to access it outside of it, you're going to get a reference error. Okay, and it's also worth mentioning that const also kind of behaves the same way with let when it comes to block scope as well. So let me go ahead and try my best to show you guys a couple of good examples. So I guess one example that we can go about is this, right? So I have two functions. The first function, hello, I declare a variable with the var keyword, and I assign the value of Anson. If I were to log this out, it would log Anson. Okay, same thing. Well, now with the hello 2, I'm trying to reference the variable name before it's being defined. Now you're going to be surprised, we're actually not going to get a runtime error. In fact, it's just going to log undefined. Now, this is because of something called hoisting. So pretty much whenever you declare a variable with var, remember, it's known throughout the entire function. Okay, but since we're trying to reference it before the initialization, by default, the value is going to be undefined. Okay, remember, it's all due to hoisting, which again, don't worry so much about that right now. It's something that's part of like a more advanced series that we'll get into later on. Okay, but let me try my best to show you another example that will really use the let keyword, because right now we've only used the var keyword, right? Now, what if I try to do this? What if I change this declaration to let? Okay, now this is going to give us an error, and this is actually called a temporal dead zone. And what that means is basically with var, right, you can actually access this variable before, if you have a var variable, you can actually access before, whereas with let, the only way to actually access, you can't access it before the variable's definition is evaluated. Okay, I know it's like some, a lot of weird stuff going on, but I'll leave like a link in the description, and you can probably like read a little bit about it. But remember, this is all like kind of like a little bit more weird advanced stuff. But for now, just focus on just understanding scope. Okay, and that will definitely go a long way. Cool. All right. But let's go ahead and show a quick example with using var and len. Okay, so let's declare a variable called do something. I'm sorry, declare a function called do something. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say, just do this, if 2 is less than 4. Let's just hard code these literals real quick. What I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a variable called let age equal 22. Or actually, we'll do something else. Let a equal 22. Okay? Now watch this. If I log a, let me actually delete these other functions as well. So it's called do something. So you're going to see it's going to log 22 perfectly, right? Okay, and if I change this to a var variable, it's going to work the same way. But what if I try to access a outside of it, right? What happens then? It still works. And you're probably wondering, well, wait, what the hell? Like, isn't this variable a inside this block scope? Remember, var variables are function scope. So even if we declare this var variable inside here, it's going to be known throughout the entire function, because right now we're inside a block scope. Okay, and var variables are function scope. If we actually change this, let's say if we actually change this to, if we actually declared a function inside this do something function, and what if I tried to log a from here? Okay, so let's call something else, and let's see what happens. And you're going to see that we actually have a is not defined, and the reason why is because remember, this variable is function scoped to do something else, not do something else. Okay, it's function scope to do something else, because remember, every single time you create a new function, it has its own scope. Okay, so if I wanted to reference a without having an error, I can do that outside of the block scope, but inside the local scope of the do something else function, which you can see over here. Okay, cool. All right, let's get rid of this function because I wanted to go back to a simple example. Okay, but notice how if I were to do let a, and if I tried to reference a outside over here again, we would get an error, because remember, a is only known inside the block and not the function. Okay, but if I change this to var, it then becomes function scope. So that's one example of, well, that's one difference between var and let. So you're probably wondering, well, when would you want to use let and when would you want to use var? And that's a very good question or observation that you might make. Well, you would want to use let for, let's say, temporary variables. So let's say if you wanted to just only have this variable inside this block scope, and once you exit this block scope, you don't care about a anymore. That would be a good reason to use the let keyword. So that way you don't have a bunch of variables scoped to the function do something. And let's just say, what if we had a variable called a already outside over here, right? Let's call this, let's give it the value of 23, right? What if I didn't want to actually modify this value, but I want to have the same variable names, right? If I were to access a inside this block scope, it would log 22. Whoops. But once I exit this block scope over here, and we're back inside the function scope, it's going to log 23. So it's a good way to actually use the same variable names, modify only, give it a different value, but only in that block scope without modifying the function scope. Okay, so hopefully that makes some good sense. Okay, and again, there are many different reasons why you would want to use the difference of var and let, and there are other differences too. But again, we're not trying to focus so much on these, crazy things, because these are a little bit more advanced in my opinion, because it's a lot different in like other languages too. For example, in Java, we don't have var and let. We just have different ways to declare variables, and we actually declare variables statically. Whoops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. We actually declare variables statically in a language like Java. Okay, but hopefully that one example, as well as the other ones, were able to kind of like give you an idea of like some differences between var and let. Okay, and yeah, again, just keep practicing with these keywords, and it'll make more sense later on. So I'll see you guys in my next video. Peace.